slide. Yeah, so where are all the forests going? That's sort of a, you know, and there's some people might remember the old Pete Seeger song about sort of tragic implications there. Where are all the flowers gone? Where have all the flowers gone? So that's where I got that title. And I wanted to start with sort of like our armchair visit through the Sierra starting south. This is the, Sequoia National Forest, 2016 Slate Fire. You can see some sort of beautiful thick forest in the background. Don't know the name of those peaks. I used to. Somebody might. And then you see a couple of snags in the foreground, and that's just this cool mix. One of the reasons my colleagues and I went up there, it was Tanya Chi and I who saw it on the hillside and said, that looks like a burn area. Let's go check it out. And sure enough, we found all manner of woodpeckers, etc., using this beautiful area that was this representing this sort of mix of intense, not so intense, and low intense burning, not low, moderate, and high severity fire, basically. So Kristen, can I have the next slide, please? And I'll just keep saying next slide, please. Thanks. So now we're going into the giant Sequoia National Forest. Actually, this is Sequoia National Monument, which is part of Sequoia National Forest. And then the question is, what kind of biodiversity are we seeing here? You can see in the foreground, there's this beautiful big snags, and they've been created sort of representing this area that burned pretty hot. And then the backdrop, even though it does have a lot of black in it, you're seeing, some of the green. And the one, if you go from there's right in the center of the slide, if you start from the bottom and go to the top, you go charred, and then there's some leaves, and then it's green at the top, which is where the sequoia is sort of in the process. This giant is in the process of making its comeback after fire. Next slide. So then the question is, what else happens? Who comes back? And that's part of what I was trying to look for here. And as you can see, there's somebody's small little seedlings started growing. Actually, it's about 2 feet tall, this one in front of me. And in the backdrop, you can see some other seedlings. And this is still, you can see this is sort of a high severity patch, or it's a patch that burned intensely, and it's covered in snow. This was in December last year. It responded to post-fire regeneration quite naturally. Nobody planted it immediately after the fire started growing. And of course, the light and various different moisture, soil, you name it, the history of the place, it's spurred the movement of these sequoias. Next slide. And next, this is a little bit of a sunny spot, so you can see the snow in the background. You're still in a high severity sort of burn patch. I like to say it burned intensely here. And there's just so much we hear about these areas not growing back. We just hear so much, and then you got to go in and say, so what's happening? How are you all doing here? They're looking pretty healthy. And even this summer when I went back, and periodically I go back, I'll explain why, and they were just looking gorgeous, young, gorgeous seedlings. So this little area represents probably, if you multiplied it into an acre, you'd have to take a square meter and multiply by maybe 1,200 or something. You could see that there would be thousands per acre, if this is a representation. And there's some variation. Sometimes you don't get this big crowd of little seedlings, but sometimes you do, like here. And now the other thing I was trying to figure out is, who comes back? What wildlife come back after when this is all done? What wildlife visits? What wildlife hunts? Investigates the area? So next slide. I put a camera in there, and sure enough, this was very shortly after I put a camera in the snow. Coyote, definitely coyote. And next slide. I got a little gray fox in another area. This is still Sequoia National Monument. Both these are Sequoia National Monument. And, right here you've got, large, I'm echoing some of the findings of a very exciting publication by Jesse Lewis, who after one of the Arizona fires said he and his colleagues found black bear, elk, mountain lion, mule deer, wolves, high occupancy. And the idea being, well, they were passing by or they're hunting or they're staying. And so the idea being, well, gosh, there's some resources here. There's little mammals all over the place. And so maybe a little easier to see with the cleared vegetation because of the fire. And so there's just such a proliferation that's happening. A lot of, sort of frequent visitors. Next slide. I got a ringtail cat. Ringtails are not very common. Now we're getting into the species of special concern category. And they're I guess they're related to civets. They're super particular, meticulous, small, agile animals, and they're just beautiful to watch. These are all videos, by the way. So, and nighttime shots usually come out in black and white in my cameras. So what's really interesting in here is that another thing to notice, I guess, is the fact that they're using this log that's as a surface, that just maybe it allows them a view, it allows them, maybe just a few seconds of an edge over a predator or over a prey. So that's something to keep in mind, because I'm thinking, well, anything that's fallen, that's treated as garbage, when it's out there in the wild, it's a table or a chair or a massage spot. I've actually seen animals even massaging themselves against vegetation. So next slide. So I'm just sort of like getting into the value system of these forests, what are these animals valuing? Where are they going? I've seen a fox actually bring, a dead, he hunted a little chipmunk. He brought it onto one of these logs. So it's a little safe haven, just a small area where it's like, now I can watch over everybody else. I got a little bit of an advantage and I can enjoy my meal right here. This is a fisher, and fishers are, endangered right now in the southern side of the Sierras. They are endangered. So this one was just a passing through, but it came back too. Saw it quite a few times. Next slide. And fishers are sort of notable animals. I don't know that I'd want to run into one at night. They're very spry and ferocious. They're sort of one step down from a wolverine. I keep saying fisher, and people ask me about what is this, what kind of bird is this kind of thing. So I have to specify it's a pretty awesome mesocarnivore of forests, and it can catch something its own size. It's not to be messed with. This investigation sort of started out because I happened to see a publication that said unlogged high severity fire areas can be suitable for fishers, maybe especially females. I think the males are using it just as much, according to what I'm seeing. There's even a male that came through with a hawk's, I think it was male with a hawk's head in its mouth. So yeah, and it sat right in the middle of one of these, logs and proceeded. So next slide. So here, I'm going to transition gradually into biomass, because that's part of what I want to talk about, because it used to be like just primarily salvage logging. And I don't know that there's really anything right about salvage logging, because, as Dr. Richard Hutto has said in multiple letters and his presentations, publications, it's just the single most negative thing you can do to the land. It's sort of like whacking it while it's in the process of trying to stand up after a fire. So it's sort of like beating it down. That's how I see it anyway. And here you have opportunistic post-fire logging. And this is primarily roadside to start with. We're still in Sequoia National Monument, and you can see that the tree in front of us, right off the road, is, it's a live tree. So there's some, okay, well, that branch is dead, so we'll just take the whole tree. That kind of thing is happening, definitely. And a quote there, post-fire landscapes are just not given that chance to get into the succession. Are they going to go through succession or not? Some people say no because of the high severity fire being too much. But do we want to give them a chance? Probably yes. So that's a quote from the Nature's Phoenix book, some of you probably pretty familiar with. All right, next slide. And yeah, so we're moving north into Yosemite National Park. This is in the background, there's Tom Conlon, a colleague and friend. And we're looking at one beautiful swath that sort of works its way into Merced Grove here. And this area is very special because we saw a very fresh fissure footprint and heard something climbing rapidly up a tree. It was too small to be a bear. Didn't get a visual. So it was really exciting. And it was what also drew us in there is that the possibility of a lot of it being taken out. So you can see the multi-layers here. And so like I was sort of tuning in. Oh, thanks, Kristen. That's good. I was going to ask for the next, I was sort of tuning in. No, that's good. Tuning into the layers of the forest. We saw that with the mammals, and we saw that with the little regrowth, etc. And now you're looking at sort of this idea of textbook thinning, like, so you're going to leave some trees in place, but a vast majority of them are gone. And the in-between space where that fissure that was in the sunlit fissure, he's going to go down in and hide in there and run through that, cover vegetation between one tree and another. So now you've got this gap. And the trees that are being taken out are pretty big. You can see from the comparison with the human size. So it's kind of, okay, yes, some trees are there, but this sort of cleanup, so to speak, is not going to give a selective advantage to some of the animals. And it's certainly it was sort of ironic because here, this was quite a bit surprise, I have to say, because, one of the things we both noticed out there was this sign saying, please don't step off the trail because you could harm the roots of the giant sequoias because they're superficial roots. And in the backdrop of that same sign was, one of the heavy duty operator equipment for tree removal. So, us humans stepping off the soil versus the big, massive tonnage of equipment, doing all the stuff you see in front of you. So yeah, thinning does tend to extract most of the largest trees. And, then the question is, does it really decrease the pace of fire? And it's fair to say it probably does in some cases. But it's also fair to say that because thinning has to pay for itself, it tends to take out the largest trees before fire. And in fact, you can see from the fire scars here that these were both taken out. I don't know, one on the back, Tanya Cheese standing there. I don't know if that was taken before the fire. It seems like it was because the cutting hadn't started here. But the one right in front of us in this slide was taken out before the fire. And so here you see the post-fire landscape behind, in front of me and the camera and behind Tanya, it was toasted. So what did thinning do except kill the remaining trees in this particular landscape here? And I've seen 12 or 13 forests where I've spent most of my time, sort of dedicated to work like this. And every time that I see the thin forest burned, at least some of the swaths and swaths and swaths, acres and acres and acres, are toasted after thinning. So the thinning is removing some trees, and then the fire is taking almost everything of the rest. So Next slide. So yeah, and this is Mendocino. So just a couple other little examples here. Oh, I see. Yeah, comment about visiting this Yosemite area. Boy, that was a hard one, I have to say. Oh, it was just hard to digest it. But yeah, so Mendocino, and this is all part of. I would say this is part of a sort of extended conversation, if you will. Although it has tragic consequences in some cases, we're just trying to have that conversation a little faster. you know. August Complex by Mendocino, and look at this. You have in the foreground like a huge tree. I think it was either a fir or a cedar. I don't know what it was, honestly. And in the backdrop, you see the tiny trees that were left behind, and they did again burn with high severity. And this represents quite a few acres, like I would say of the order of hundreds, because the big trees are taken out as part of sort of an operation so that the soil is a bit compromised and it's dried out a little bit. So once the soil is dry, then and a fire can really whip through. I'm not saying thinning doesn't work. There are times when it does, and I have seen that. But I would say I've seen a lot of this, a lot. So next slide. And this was a LSR, late successional reserve in Mendo, and the area was about to be, in fact, has just been marked, for hazard removal or for more. I'm not really sure what the plan is. But there's a northern spotted owl, female. She's asleep. And of course, the little fledgling is way curious. He's just completely interested in everything in the world. Anything below him, anything around him. He's just constantly, what I call all caps in terms of the eyes. So right after August Complex fire, and this is a small late successional reserve, I have to say a lot of this burn very intensely. But the nest was in this cavity. It looked like a fir cavity where the branch had broken off, probably during the fire, and there was a hole created by the branch breaking off. And she raised 3 young there. I mean, it was successfully. One was hammered. We don't know by what, but some chew marks on the feathers indicate it's probably a mesocarnivore. And the other 2 survived. Next slide. And this is, sorry, a little bit out of focus here, but it's grabbed from video. But it's just a quote from Monica Bond and Lee and Bond, a 2015 paper, that they actually found spotted owls came right back, basically. Short version of what they're saying here is in that 2015 paper, came right back, did great. Here's 2 young. Proof, evidence. So what's really interesting here is this pair is very dedicated to this one area. And of course, they found this in many, many occupancy studies. There's some very dedicated Forest Service biologists behind this work, and then they sort of took their data. And it was like, okay, it's 1 year later or 2 years later. In this case of this photograph, is 2 years later, but 1 year after the fire, they saw all the owls coming back, which is encouraging. You see, they're in a live tree. So a lot of times they'll go into the low, moderate, intensely burned, not intensely burned, but low, moderate severity fire areas. And they'll, that's got the cover, that's got the snag where they can possibly use a cavity for raising their young. And so the high severity fire presents an opportunity with its next door, it presents an opportunity to get a lot of the prey base they need to raise their young. So yeah, so a lot of resources here for the owls. And you can see here's this is a part of Stanislaus. So now we moved from Yosemite to Stanislaus, which is pretty much just west of Yosemite, this swath. And gosh, when people see this, they go, wow, okay, yeah, I understand you've got a lot of nice little saplings here, but gosh, look at those trees. But actually, if you see it, it's a small patch. It's not a huge patch of intensely burned area, and there's live trees behind it. In fact, right up the hill, you can see, the the conifers are alive. And then if you look at the left corner, top left corner of the slide, and imagine yourself going up that hill, it's a hill, there was a goshawk nest up there, nesting quite successfully, 3 young. So next slide, please. Thanks. There she is. The young are very small, little downy feathers all over the place. She was sitting there. I saw her in the early stages, and then I saw her in the later stages where the young were pretty much fighting with each other. There was one very dominant one, and the other ones were not, they were just sort of like cowering down. So one had grown a little faster. So this whole area was actually, I'm going to give you a little bit of bad news, but I'm going to try not to emphasize it. So next slide. Just want to warn you that she did not come back. And there's a blackback woodpecker here with little, well, actually that's a wood boring beetle larva, which is bang for the buck for blackbacks because they're just so, they just get more of a meal than the smaller bark beetle larvae, which they will also take. But this is real bang for the buck, and blackbacks just go for that in intensely burned forest. And so here, whoops, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to stop the slideshow because I know we started late, so I got a little bit more time. A quote from Hutto, not only is it abundantly clear that many plants and animals depend on these severely burned areas, it's also clear that, salvage logging has uniform negative effects. So I'm just sort of preparing you for what's to come. So there was blackbacks, there was the goshawk, there was downy, there was northern flicker, a lot of woodpeckers, and also red-tailed hawk nesting. There was a lot of predator birds, and there were a lot of woodpeckers and smaller cavity nesters, secondary cavity nesters. Next slide. And so that's the same area where the blackback was, and then up in the left-hand corner again, if you went up that hill, that's where the goshawk was. The goshawk area was not actually touched. We reported about that goshawk nest, and that was not touched. But the fact is that this area, you can see a skid road in the background there. So this area has been pretty much like a scorched earth. Initially, it was like scorched earth. It was just taken out. You can see that there might have been some Roundup applications. I see that every year up here in the Stanislaus, and a lot of others like Plumas. There's a lot of others that are using it just to sort of hammer the shrubs. Early stages in the spring, and obviously some other, if it's a broadcast spray, then other trees can be affected, like the little seedlings and saplings here can be affected. So you can see some browning here. It could be operator equipment, but also some of the operators are pretty careful, others are not. It's it's a big mixed bag. But salvage logging this was done primarily for biomass energy. It was sort of, I'm assuming it went down the hill, and I'll be sharing some of that. So then the question becomes, where did it come from? And it's basically, it was HUD money, housing and urban development money, in the millions for this particular project. Sort of an interesting example. So also want to point out that even this large, in this patch where the thinned area burned with high severity layer, you can see that a lot of when the big trees are taken, you think, oh, that's being sequestered as lumber or something. But I've seen some alarming numbers, like a lot of the lumber processing takes wood being incinerated to power the facilities. And so then what you end up with is anywhere between 15% and 50% off that what you're seeing in front of you in this slide. So it's sort of interesting, because it's not like everything is guaranteed to be sequestered. It's half or less is going to be sequestered for some amount of time during which the product is made. Alrighty, so we're gonna go into another example of sort of some of the cutting that supports biomass energy. Now, this down in Sequoia National Forest, and this is an area that burned in the Windy Fire. And you know what's interesting here? You have a small high severity patch, but I want to point out it's not always like acres and acres and acres. For example, look at the live trees in the backdrop. It's not like you have just like a complete dead zone. So even though this was thinned, here's an example of something where, you do have a lot of live trees left in the backdrop. Next slide. So I'm just gonna go through just one like quick set of slides, and this is sort of citing the Bradley et al. Paper from 2016, where they noticed that areas that were intensely managed also intensely burned. And an example of that is right here in what experienced, I think, the Rim fire or one before that. I'm not really sure which one, but this is Stanislaus again. And we're kind of saying, I'm sort of rounding up a story about Stanislaus here with what's going on the ground. After the intact forest was thinned, the same forest burned with high severity, which is something I've been talking about. It's sort of something I've been interested in looking at a little bit, because inspired by several colleagues, Chad Hansen, Doug Bevington, and Dominic De La Sala, Curtis Bradley, so many people, Tanya Chi, she and I have been in the field so much in recent years. So, what really happens after the area is thinned? Basically, after the high severity burn, it becomes a commercial cut because that's allowed with this primarily sort of snag forest, snags being standing dead trees. So what ends up happening is something that started out trying to save part of the forest from fire by thinning actually ended up saving nothing in a swath like this. So that's something we should probably keep in mind, is if we look really closely at how much this is happening, can we do that? We can with mapping, right? How much is this happening everywhere? Okay, so next slide. Like I need to race through. And where is it being taken? So basically, apparently some long distances, but sometimes they go really short distances. Oh, I wanna point out, next slide. Just before I jump here, I'm seeing notes coming up, so I'm going to quickly say that thinning is typically anywhere from 50 to 80% of trees removed. It seems like thinning is becoming pretty hardcore these days, but what I am seeing is the largest trees are removed almost uniformly across the board, unless somebody's coming in really carefully, deliberately trying to figure out, hey, we need to leave, these beautiful heritage trees, etc. So that's the limits in which I've seen these projects operate. This is Chinese camp facility. Now you can see a truck way in the background. This is a drone shot, and you can see logs stockpiled in the foreground of the photo, and then sort of a whitish looking truck and a small operator in the way background. And if you can see that these logs are actually being processed into the chips that are going to be taken. I just want a quick quote from Searchinger et al. 2023, a fabulous paper from World Resource Institute about the forests and what's happening with forests right now. Multiple studies have shown harvesting wood instead of leaving trees harvested in the forest will increase net emissions in the atmosphere. So basically, you're playing a game of, when thinning comes in or post-fire clear cutting, whatever happens, there's just a massive amount of emissions associated with the harvesting. And in fact, he's saying it will increase net emissions in the atmosphere for decades to centuries. So next slide. So this is what you pass by when you're on the way to Yosemite. This is what you don't see when you're on the way to Yosemite. And this is right next door. There's railway tracks going in off in this direction, but I don't think they deliver by rail. Here's Pacific Ultra Power in Chinese Camp. So this is pretty hidden, and it's a 24/7 facility where you can see, I mean, in fact, you can't see in this slide, but that same white truck came over and then backed up to where that the long sort of transportation, sort of conveyor belt is delivering the chips to this massive area. Next slide. So biomass energy burns, like there's this idea that they burn chips and they burn like slash and they burn unusable material. And that is probably true. But there's two things to think about here. One is that biomass energy itself with the incineration, it burns large trees and other woody material as well. The second thing, which I really recently found out, is that it burns when they're trying to make pellets, wood pellets, that has to use some of that heartwood. I don't think they use the bark and the small branches for it. So that's all real slash, and pellets exclusively use these big materials. Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So basically, biomass energy is sort of every single version of waste that you can imagine. If you think coal is bad, biomass energy is 1.5 times bad compared to coal, and it is 4 times bad compared to natural gas. So the emissions are so high, and I remember I asked Dr. Mark Harmon about this, and he said, well, wood is partly oxidized already. Coal is just super dense, and so it's so tightly packed, it's a more efficient burning process. Wood is more oxidized, it's less dense, and so it takes more wood to generate the same amount of power. So that's why biomass energy is so dangerous, so non-renewable, absolutely non-renewable. It would take these trees hundreds of years to grow, decades to century. First, the minimum would be what, 70 years, and the max is just several hundred years, right? So, and of course, it doesn't really have legs to stand on. It's primarily subsidies. It has to. Biomass energy was down several years ago. Let's say around 2019, some facilities were completely down, and now they're ramped up because of sort of subsidies, which I guess in part come out of our tax dollars. They're just basically big, heavy duty dollars being offered to the industry, and then it's being marketed as clean. Like, for example, Sonoma County has now we found out 16% biomass energy, which to me is pretty shocking that they're calling it clean energy, so since it's not clean, and also taking money from wind and solar. All right, next slide. Yeah, and that's Scotia, and that's just really another example, and you can see that cloud there, which is really interesting because some people call it steam, and steam doesn't stay. Clouds with other materials do. In fact, the drone that was flying this flight turned black when it came back. Next slide. And Scotia's also a lot of lumber. As you can see here, there's a forest behind. It seems like it's a plantation more than anything else. So they're using lumber, but then they're also taking out some of the materials that are not usable, go straight, like including big logs, go straight into the biomass facility. That's the photo you saw before that slide. It's right next to this one. Next slide. Yeah, and that's a close-up of the biomass area in Scotia. It's it's pretty heavy duty. It's a big megawatt project there. Next slide. And as with most biomass energy facilities, there are fires within the facilities themselves. I think This was on June 1st or 2nd. I was driving back from Humboldt and just happened to see this massive cloud of smoke. And of course, this is not white. And the firefighters were desperately trying to spray. Initially, I think it was pretty hard to fight this one. It was a conveyor belt combustion, I'm pretty sure, and I think possibly there's other forms of combustions, in storage combustion, because it's exothermic and it's just composting and it just combusts spontaneously, or something that'll spark, like but there's a lot of biomass fires. Next slide. So then the question becomes, I know this is a quick transition into, what is the issue with wildfire? We have such an inherent fear. Everybody has a fear of wildfire. And, I want to take this quote from Jack Cohen that's all about, home hardening. And if homes are sufficiently resistant, then, we've got, they can survive fire, because it's a home ignition. Wildfires, from our perspective, it's a home ignition problem, not a wildland firefighting problem. If the emphasis was shifted to, hey, we're going to put gravel out there, we're going to do non-combustible materials, you're going to use metal for the roof, screens on the vents, etc. You've heard all this before. Then we've got more of a success story build up, rather than fighting the entire wildland that continues to burn because the grasses are like avena will grow so fast after operators have been through with thinning, etc. So you still have fast fires after thinning. So the emphasis shifting. The film Elemental, Reimagine Wildfire, is a fantastic sort of story of Jack Cohen's work. So I highly recommend that film. Next slide. Yeah, so basically, he also says, of course, fuel treatments around the homes, right, or immediately around the homes, sort of thinning, pruning, whatever it takes. All right, next slide. So I did want to point out that in a lot of the fires, especially some of the large wildfires, are in part, very honest attempts to stop fire with fire, which is called backburning. And in the case of Dixie Fire, one of the backfires ended up burning a lot of Lassen National Park. And it was just sort of one of these astonishing things that, you can actually have backfires that actually increase that massive amount of acreage. So I don't have the calculation. I think Bryant Baker is a good person to talk about this idea that backburns are actually, in some cases with the extreme fires, they're actually going to increase the total acreage of the fire. Next slide. Another Jack Cohen. This is one of the backfires from the Dixie Fire, and you're looking right at it. This is Maidu Land. This is Tasman Koyam. It's a new name for Humbug Meadow. And I've been doing a lot of work out there. It's been wonderful working with them, with the community there, Maidu Summit Consortium. And let's see. So yeah, you could see what's one of the interesting things about this photo is that, there's such a patchwork quilt, if you will, of different types of fire intensities, including the high severity fire. And right out there in that mix, in that forest that you're looking at in this slide, I've seen bears and badgers, which are, again, species of special concern. It's a special thing for badgers to be here. So I'm just hoping that they can save some of that beautiful habitat that's remaking itself as we speak. Next slide. And so back to Bev Law's first quote that started my first slide. What if the rule was to protect trees as if they're greater than 15 inches in diameter? You see, that would protect about 70% of the carbon in trees. So keeping all the large trees, the focus on, sort of removing, if thinning really needs to be done, to focus on the small trees. Next slide. Oh, here's our badger. That's from Lassen area. Now I do have a note that's been slated for clear cutting, and that's part of a commercial salvage log sale. So I'm not really sure if how the badger's going to fare once all that is done. Certainly, I know one thing from monitoring badgers is that they're burrowing mammals, so they're extremely sensitive to vibration. And so, you know, if they're in a burrow, they're just going to close up that burrow and try to, you know, hole up in there. But how long they'll hang out is not known once you know, clear cutting is done. I think a lot of this is really unknown. Next slide. And a little fisher. This was a young fisher in Lassen. Now this area has been clear cut, and partly for biomass, because the biomass facility, I was kind of surprised they were going to Bernie from all the way from Lassen. So anyway, it's a mix of biomass as well as, you know, lumber. But I never did see that fisher again. I did see an adult fisher though in December. So that's cool. Fishers were relocated here in Lassen, and so it's just really heartening to see them. Somebody did see a wolf track up in this area as well. Next slide. And Sierra Nevada red fox. I didn't want to end on a very discouraging note, but here's the hope. The hope is if we can see that mammals, large and small, are using these places, that they're sort of exciting for those mammals, that they investigate, they're good with it. They're like, okay, let's start. You know, it happened, but let's start right now with all the small mammals that are available, or, you know, who are goshawks doing the same thing, birds, mammals. And if they're using it, should we be reevaluating? Should we be saying, hey, wait a minute. Next slide. I think I'm done. Yeah, this is Brian Baker's slide. So this is Brian Baker's slide of the Dixie Fire, and I think he talked about it being which parts will backfire, and because he was doing day-to-day mapping when this was going on. So this is the final map of the Dixie Fire. Yeah, so I think I'm ready for questions, and I'm sorry about that beginning with the slideshows, you know, slideshow snafu, but really glad that I sent that to Kristen. Thank you so much, Kristen, for your help. And yeah, Jennifer, if anyone has questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Maya, so much for such a fantastic visual demonstration of what's happening on the ground. And before I get started, Karen, maybe just how long do we want to go with questions given the late start? Okay, I'll just start asking questions. But but I also want to say, Maya, I hope we have a minute or so to have you give us a sample of your poetry.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So yeah, we had a number of questions. One questioner asks, how long after fire does it take for animals to come back?
Oh, wow, good one. So I think Pepplewood Preserve had a great example of this. The coyotes, I think Steve, who's out there, I forget his last name. Coyotes were back in a day, and somebody actually who was saving his home and the neighbor's home while the fire was going on saw deer crossing from the burn across the flame line, which was starting to creep from the unburned to the burn, and just munching on the grass. He said he had this Bambi story in his head, and that just flew away after he saw that. So yeah, anywhere from hours to weeks, I would say. Someone else who's monitoring mountain lions, a mountain lion expert from Sonoma, said a couple of weeks later they found that the mountain lion and her kitten were deep in a canyon, and they thought they were lost because the signal wasn't going off, but that's because they were hidden deep in a canyon. So yeah, I mean, I would say days to weeks. And then I don't know that they would necessarily use those areas, but once the small mammals start, I would say the following season, you know, you got the prey, you're there.
Okay, great. And you talked about thinning a lot. How specifically do you personally define thinning?
Oh yeah, yeah. I was gonna try to do that, and I was trying to catch up with some of the comments. But yeah, I would say from my standpoint, thinning is defined as if it's non-commercial thinning, which is amazing. When people do that, they just sort of there's some groups who can actually just do hand removals of small materials, primarily focused on protecting a home space, protecting a community space, all the way to commercial that's taking out most of the large trees. I would say maybe a screen of large trees is left in place, but most or all of the largest trees are removed in some of the backcountry commercial thinning projects. And that's 50 to 70%. And so that's it's not my definition. That's how thinning. I mean, how I look at it is thinning is one word. It's like I say, I ate a meal. You can't tell anything about what I might have eaten junk food. I might have eaten a salad. Thinning is one thing for 1,000 different types of actions, and a lot of them are pretty bad.
Okay, and another question about redwoods, fuzzy redwoods, charred tall but no branches after 3 years. Are they recovering or not? Do you know?
Yeah, the fuzzy redwoods are definitely, this is something that's very much been debated. The epicormic branching of sequoias, sempervirens, is absolutely um, in the throes of recovering or rejuvenating after fire, whichever word you want to pick. In fact, 5 years post-fire, Mark West Springs area from 5 years post-Tubbs, you can see that that's just turning into a regular looking tree without the bottle brush stuff.
Okay, good to hear. Good to know. So, are you aware of any independent studies showing what happens to thinned areas in subsequent fires, and the intensity of the fires that do follow in thinned areas?
Yeah, there's one really good study, but there's several good studies actually. There's a great one by Steve Dunn and his colleagues up in Oregon University, OSU, I think. And they saw just across the board the thinned areas were, sort of like areas that was super heavily managed. I would say thinned is just it's such a hard word because it means so many things. But if they're heavily managed with commercial logging, um, that leaves some in place and takes a lot. It's high intensity fire. And the same thing, Bradley et al. 2016, which was mentioned in the slideshow. The slideshow can be available, I'm sure, because it's recorded. And the Bradley et al., if you look at that, do intensely managed areas burn more severely? Yes, across the board, they found pretty much they did. Yeah, does that answer everything?
Well, I think so. So, there's a comment about salvage logging is being promoted as forest improvement, not just by industry, but also by our university forestry departments.
Yeah.
And the comment further states that it must be mostly about money from the logging. It sounds like a big duh to me. Any thoughts about how we get it to stop?
Salvage logging. Yeah, I would just say, it's a critical mass. Tell 100 people that you know. It really has to be one of the worst things, add insult to injury. Like, I don't really think a fire is natural. Native Americans will tell you, Native Indians will tell you, from the Northeast will tell you, fire is natural, fire belongs there, fire does a good job. Let fire do its job. Natural fire, Bill Trips, I've seen a quote from Bill Trips, I think Doug Bevington sent it out once. The fire out there did its thing. Lightning did its thing. We did our thing. There was cultural fire, there was natural fire. And fire, the thing was interesting about wildfire prevention agencies is that they you can't prevent fire. Fire can't be prevented. It's like saying lightning prevention agency. No. Volcano prevention agency? No. You can't prevent fires, you can't prevent lightning, and you can't prevent volcanoes. They're all part of the natural system. As many, the native indigenous tribes and many people from, India, where I'm originally from, we all say the same. So, yeah, I mean, I think salvage logging is sort of the insult that is, hitting something when it's already just trying it, sort of flattened, and then it's trying to come up. So, yeah, as fast as we can get rid of salvage logging is better. And also, it is called restoration, but if some of us have seen how that restoration works, if you're combining the restoration with Roundup applications, the way some of agencies are doing, it's just so difficult. You've got the soil that's been all stirred up because operational equipment is so heavy. It's just thundering up and down the mountains with this smashing the soil, etc., in the mycorrhizae. So it's not going to be a success story with a little seedling trying to make it back after you replant it. So it can't really be called restoration either, in my view.
And just for clarification purposes for our listening audience, can you differentiate salvage logging from clearcutting?
Oh, so clearcutting, a lot of times it'll happen, in a thinning project, there's small clear cuts, small units that are just like sort of cleared completely. And sometimes it's right by the side of a road, so it's convenient. There's some big legacy trees, so those are removed. So that can be pre-fire, that kind of clear cutting. But salvage logging is a different kind of clear cut that focuses primarily on snags, which are standing dead trees that are literally the apartment complexes for almost every species I named during this presentation. Apartments, rest stops, hunting grounds, you name it. They're really, really valuable. They're just a body of valuable wood for all the animals. So they cut snags, but they also cut things that look like snags and are very much alive. They're just coming back to life, but they just haven't had enough time to show themselves. And so they're leafing out, or maybe about to leaf out, but you look up, you see the brown, you're like, that it's dead. So salvage logging takes live and dead trees pretty much in a swath as a clear cut after fire.
Okay, and thank you and for that response. So you briefly touched on prescribed fire, and specifically how a prescribed fire sometimes backfires in terms of what's intended. So how do you see the activity of prescribed fires to fight fire?
Yeah, so I think that some of the prescribed fires that have been done, like traditional practice prescribed fires, sort of like informed by traditional methods, I think that's pretty amazing because it's targeted at, saving an area or harvesting an area in a way, burning an area in a way to encourage certain weaving plants or certain harvesting plants, oaks, so that's, and also if it's done immediately before a fire by some chance, it can actually change that profile of the fire in that area, because that fire is already burned. So it's not going to be whipping through that area because the fire has already laid the groundwork of the vegetation. And so the next fire that comes through, if a wildfire comes through in this area, it really does make a difference. Prescribed fires never also includes pile burning. So in other words, pile burning is most of what prescribed fire is. I mean, it's not like this wonderful image you see in the newspapers and articles where somebody's with a drip torch, sort of walking around and trying to sort of create this low intensity fire area, which, by the way, some of them go out of control, and we've seen that recently. So there can be tragic consequences. But prescribed fire really does include some of that pile burning. You see piles on the side of the road or something. Some of them won't make it to when they are fired up, but in winter, they're winter burned. And so that's also counted as prescribed fire. And that's a massive amount of emissions of sometimes great material that, in my view, from what I've seen, animals can use it.
Okay, and citing recent efforts in California to weaken or eliminate CEQA and fully protected species laws, do you know if anything has been done to target species of special concern status which you mentioned several times.
Yeah, now what's happening is with there's fishers in the news today or yesterday. I just saw an article sent by a colleague, Jen Mamola. So they're trying to figure out if fisher can be special status declared as protected in Oregon all the way down to, now it's protected in Southern California. Can it be protected in Northern California and Southern Oregon as a listed species? And unfortunately, the rationale they're giving is that fishers are losing their habitat due to tree mortality and fire. When what I'm finding is fishers are in the post-fire areas, and I don't know about tree mortality areas because I haven't seen like high concentrations of that. But post-fire areas are absolutely being used by fishers. All the ones that I've documented in Sequoia National Monument, up in Lassen, in and also even Klamath. They're post-fire areas, and the fishers are using them. They're definitely using them because I'm seeing them on day 3 and day 4 after putting the camera in, and that means it's not like it took them a long time to get there. They're there.
Okay, and can you say more about Roundup applications and restoration, because that's another shocker?
Oh yeah, so Roundup applications are pretty routine. You'll see, like, if you see brown stuff on the sides of the roads, that's the signal right there. The vegetation, of course, everybody probably knows this. It's sprayed on the top, and then it sort of like puts the plant in overdrive all the way down to the roots and kills it that way. Very, very short turnaround time. What's really yeah, it is shocking, and it's really hard to imagine anything productive about Roundup application. What they're trying to do, I think, is to make sure that they guarantee that the cover vegetation is not going to inhibit the little seedlings and saplings from growing. Now, the problem is the seedlings and saplings, a lot of us have actually seen in the field, especially the recent Sierra Club forest trip. They're growing just fine from under the ceanothus and under the other shrubs. The conifers are growing fine. So to hit other plants so that they don't interfere with conifer growth is sort of interesting, because the other plants give it shade, give it moisture, give it, they're nitrogen fixing, they give it nutrients. There's a collaboration going on. It's a teamwork there. It's teamwork. But so Roundup is it's just, I don't really approve of using Roundup in forests as part of restoration. You're killing in order to be able to get conifers. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
And what about planting of genetically modified trees as part of a restoration attempt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they've got some, genetically superior trees that or they think they are. My question on that is, like, how do you know what's genetically superior if you're removing 80% of it or 70% of it during thinning? How much genetically superior stuff has been removed already? It's just, shouldn't that be tested? Shouldn't the trees that are there just giving us their carbon sequestration potential be tested for the power to resist climate change, for example? And how much are we removing already that is giving us resistance to, gifting us for free with the resistance to climate change they already have? Somebody also asked about soil microbes and genetically engineered soil microbes, which I think is a huge concern, and enough risk assessment cannot be done. I mean, you just have to do this before spilling it out into acres and acres of forests, or actually farmlands that can just spill over, because bacteria are prolific. Soil microbes are going to be prolific, and it can just take over. So I appreciate that question. I don't think enough is known, and I don't think enough risk assessment can possibly be done. We have to do a lot.
Okay, great. And I just want to first of all apologize that we can't get to all of the questions asked. So I apologize to you that we didn't get to your questions. I'm going to ask you one more, and then hopefully you'll give us a poem.
Okay.
All right. And that question is, one of your slides had a quote by Bev Law about protecting trees greater than 15 inches would help retain 70% of the carbon in the forest. So are you specifically proposing that trees greater than 15 inches no longer be cut down? And is there a bill we can support or a letter we can write to support this?
You know, I'm not specifically recommending it because I just love those little seedlings and saplings that are all over Sequoia National Monument right now. And they're all smaller. But yeah, I mean, I think that if it's around the homes, you know, thinning or pruning, trimming, that kind of thing, you know, we can focus on small and limbing trees up, and that's all these textbook things that uh, not only firefighters but fire scientists tell us to do. um I think as far as forests go, yeah, I mean, focusing on, if you have to thin, if it can just be focused on really small trees and hand equipment. I think part of the problem is soil. I think whoever talked about that soil microbe question is hitting the nail on the head. I think the soil disaster is something we don't even see. We can't. It's underground. It's a whole ecosystem down there we don't even know yet. And so to destroy the soil with heavy duty equipment is really, I'm sure, really hard on the soil, and part of the reason why a lot of those seedlings are not going to survive. So, you know, I would like to save a lot of trees, and I understand the fear of fire makes us feel like we need to protect ourselves. So whatever it takes to, I would go with Jack Cohen's recommendations any day, you know, and Alexander Seifert. People have done all this work about how much to remove. And, you know, forest thinning should not be taking the largest trees. That's just the way it is. That's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of carbon sequestration and fighting climate change. That's bang for the buck right there. So I would, you know, also the idea that the forests are overcrowded has been really heavily contested in studies. So it would be great for people to understand that, sure, forests were widely spaced in the past, but some of them were also crowded. It was both.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank you again for a really fantastic talk. And now a little poetry, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, and I want to say that you know, that I'm thinking, Jennifer, that we're going to save the chat. So if anyone's you know, other additional questions, I'm happy to answer them and provide, you know, references, because of course I can't even keep up with the material that's coming out. There's some amazing literature coming out. I'm going to just really quickly, and I'm, again, apologies for the shared screen share function there. Um, let's see. I want to end in a note with hope, and a note of hope. And I have a poem called The Sierra, a History. So I'm just going to read that out. The Sierra, a History. Not long after lightning has rushed down the electric staircase of its own making, not long after fires 5 stories tall have swept up canyon, a new season begins. Silencing, spreading like hands to touch the heads of seedlings and fiddleheads, nudging out by the hundreds through ceilings of soil and ashy debris. Here is a stand of charred oaks, unwrapping its storage of gangly leaves. There a knot of cones thrown open by heat releases seeds ripe for sun. Currents of brightness are charged from within. Sunlight plucks at the strings of top branches. Up at the crown, blackened firs begin again their story of vigor, edged with new needles. Irresistible music, tinsel and chime notes. The burned and crackling world is not in shambles, not gone to ash and ash alone. Sapsucker, pileated, black-backed woodpeckers all join the jig of genetic diversity. All build from scratch. What do they crave? The riches hidden in the wide open arches rising from the grave. Thanks so much for asking for a poem.
Well, and on those lovely words, we'll end. And thank you, everybody, for attending today.
Let me say a few
Look forward
words
to
about
seeing you
next time.
month. Yeah.
Let me say a few words about next month. So our next Forest Protection Forum will be on October 16th. That's the third Monday of the month, which is what we usually do. And the speaker will be John Telberth, and he'll be talking about economics and forests. So hope to see all of you then. Thank you. Good night.